He was the emperor who slept with his sister, married his horse, and turned the Roman Empire into a theater of insanity. When Caligula came to power, he was young, adored, and seen as the savior of Rome after years of fear under Tiberius. But power fed his madness. Within months he was forcing senators to watch his nightly orgies, where his sister Drusilla shared his bed beside courtesans and nobles, and later his beloved horse Incitatus. He built marble stables for the animal, gave it golden cups to drink from, and announced that their union was sacred. What began as eccentricity became open degradation, and Rome learned what it meant to live under a man who believed nothing was forbidden, not incest, not blasphemy, not the collapse of reason itself. Rome exploded with joy when Caligula took the throne in 37 AD because the city had just survived decades under Tiberius, a paranoid old man who'd spent his final years executing anyone he suspected of disloyalty and filling prisons with senators who'd looked at him wrong. Now here came this 24-year-old prince the soldiers absolutely worshipped, the kid who'd grown up running around military camps in miniature armor, earning the nickname Caligula, which meant little boots, and the Senate couldn't give him power fast enough because everyone was so desperate for things to get better. Those first months seemed to prove they'd made the right choice as he pardoned political prisoners, threw spectacular public games that thrilled the crowds, handed out massive bonuses to the troops, and generally acted like the generous young ruler everyone had been praying for after years of terror under the previous regime. Then around 7 months into his reign, he caught a severe fever that nearly killed him, and when he finally recovered after weeks of delirium, something fundamental had changed in how he understood his position. Romans loved to blame that illness for everything that came after, as if a sickness could somehow explain the transformation, but the reality was probably much simpler and infinitely more disturbing. He'd spent his entire childhood and adolescence watching relatives murder each other for power, had seen his own mother and brothers deliberately starve to death in Tiberius's prisons while he survived by learning to smile and appear harmless, and now suddenly he controlled the world's most powerful empire and realized with absolute clarity that nobody on earth could actually stop him from doing whatever he wanted. The shift happened fast enough that it caught everyone off guard as he began testing the limits of his newfound power. He started showing up to Senate meetings and openly mocking the elderly politicians who theoretically ran the empire, making them jog alongside his chariot through the city streets like common servants, forcing them to stand and pour wine at dinner parties while prostitutes and actors lounged in seats of honor that traditionally belonged to aristocrats. When someone in the crowd at the public games failed to applaud enthusiastically enough for his taste, he'd have guards drag that person out of their seat and beat them to death right there in the stadium, not discreetly behind closed doors where executions normally happened, but out in the open where the entire crowd could watch and understand what happened when you didn't worship the emperor properly. Senators would sit there clapping until their hands hurt, these supposedly powerful men who govern Rome, absolutely terrified of this kid who was young enough to be their grandson, and Caligula would watch them and laugh because he could see the fear in their eyes, and that's when he truly grasped the full scope of what he'd inherited. Within his first year as emperor, he'd moved beyond simply abusing his authority and started proclaiming himself an actual living god who demanded immediate worship from everyone around him. He'd walk into temples dressed in elaborate costumes with fake beards and theatrical props representing Jupiter or Apollo or whichever deity he felt like being that day, commanding the priests to bow down and worship him on the spot, and any priest who showed even a moment's hesitation would simply disappear and never be seen again. He commissioned a massive golden statue of himself and attempted to have it installed in the holiest Jewish temple in Jerusalem, which nearly triggered a full-scale revolt across Judea until his advisors managed to quietly sabotage the project by creating endless bureaucratic delays. The imperial palace transformed into his personal temple where senators were legally required to prostrate themselves before him and make religious offerings as if he were genuinely divine rather than just a delusional tyrant, and he spent absolutely staggering amounts of money from the imperial treasury building an elaborate bridge that connected his bedroom directly to the temple of Jupiter because he insisted he needed a private walkway to visit his fellow gods without having to mingle with mortals on the regular streets. Everything about the palace changed to reflect his new divine status as the building became a place where normal reality seemed to stop functioning according to any recognizable rules, and it was in this transformed environment that his relationship with his sister Drusilla evolved from family affection into something Rome had never witnessed before. Drusilla wasn't just Caligula's favorite sister among his 3 siblings. She became his official divine consort in a relationship that went far beyond anything Romans had seen from their emperors. After declaring himself a god, he announced that she was also divine and that their relationship constituted a sacred marriage between deities exactly like Jupiter and Juno in the ancient mythology everyone knew, and what might look like incest to ignorant mortals who didn't understand divine matters was actually the holy union of 2 gods joined in sacred purpose. He gave her titles that had never existed before in Roman government, built temples across the empire where citizens were legally required to worship her image alongside his own, and seated her on a throne right beside him during state ceremonies while he explained to increasingly uncomfortable senators that their union was blessed by the gods themselves and anyone who dared question it was committing blasphemy punishable by immediate execution. The relationship played out publicly in ways that made it impossible for anyone to pretend they didn't understand what was happening. He'd hold her hand during official state functions, kiss her in front of the entire imperial court, bring her to his bed during the palace orgies that had become regular occurrences where senators and their wives would be forced to watch or even participate in the spectacles unfolding around them. The parties became infamous throughout Rome not just for the sex but for the calculated humiliation woven through everything that happened. Caligula would select a senator's wife from the crowd during these events, rape her right there in front of her husband while everyone watched, then send her back to sit beside her spouse afterward with detailed commentary on her performance as if she'd just acted in some theatrical production and he was providing a professional review. The husbands had to sit there and accept it without showing any reaction, had to thank the emperor afterward for the honor of his attention, because refusing his advances or showing any sign of anger or disgust meant immediate execution for treason against a god. When Drusilla died suddenly in 38 AD from a fever, just 2 years into his reign, Caligula's response was extreme even by his increasingly deranged standards as the loss seemed to shatter whatever thin thread of restraint had been keeping him somewhat functional. He made it illegal for anyone in the entire city of Rome to laugh, to bathe, to eat dinner with their families, because if the divine sister of a god emperor had died then joy itself had to be forbidden as a sign of proper mourning. He had the Senate officially deify her through formal religious ceremony, building temples across the empire where worship of the dead Drusilla became mandatory under penalty of law, and he'd spend hours at these temples weeping and praying to her image while the business of governing the empire ground to a halt. The grief also seemed to unlock something even darker in him as the cruelty became noticeably more random and the violence more frequent, as if he was lashing out at a world that had dared to take something from a god. The palace orgies intensified after Drusilla was gone as he'd appear at these events wearing elaborate women's clothing and full makeup, or sometimes completely naked regardless of who was present, or dressed in costumes representing various gods and goddesses, and everyone had to treat whatever he chose to wear as perfectly appropriate imperial dress. Between the courses of food and wine, he'd have gladiators fight to the death right there in the banquet hall for entertainment, but sometimes he'd suddenly grab someone from the crowd, maybe a senator who hadn't been laughing at his jokes loudly enough or a merchant who'd failed to applaud enthusiastically enough at the right moment, and he'd throw them into the makeshift arena to be killed, not as punishment for any actual crime they'd committed but simply because he felt like watching them die in that particular moment. The guests would watch these respectable Roman citizens get butchered on the floor and they'd clap and cheer with appropriate enthusiasm because failing to show sufficient enjoyment of the entertainment meant you'd be the next person bleeding out while your friends applauded your death. And it was during this period of intensifying madness that his obsession with his horse Incitatus became something beyond eccentric and entered the realm of deliberate mockery of everything Rome claimed to value. Incitatus wasn't just Caligula's favorite horse. The animal lived better than almost anyone in the Roman Empire as the emperor had a stable built from pure marble with ivory feeding troughs and purple blankets that were legally restricted to imperial use only. He assigned Incitatus a full staff of servants who had previously attended actual nobility, had the horse fed oats mixed with actual gold flakes, gave it wine to drink from golden cups, and provided sleeping conditions more luxurious than most senators could afford for their own families. The stable was just the beginning of how far Caligula took his obsession with the animal as he started hosting formal state dinners where Incitatus was brought into the banquet hall as the guest of honor while senators sat around the table pretending this was completely normal behavior for the ruler of the known world. He'd personally hand-feed the horse during these dinners, toast to its health between courses, give long speeches about Incitatus's noble character and superior judgment compared to the corrupt senators surrounding them, and he announced repeatedly his genuine intention to make the horse a consul, one of the two highest political offices in Rome. He wasn't joking or being metaphorical about this plan as he talked about it constantly and in specific detail, describing how Incitatus would be more effective than any human politician because animals were incapable of the lies and scheming that plagued the Senate, and he commissioned an entire house to be built and furnished for the horse complete with marble floors and expensive decorations as if the animal would actually live there like a person conducting the business of state. The birthday parties Caligula threw for Incitatus cost more than feeding entire military legions for a month as he had artists create formal portraits of the horse in the style usually reserved for important political figures, commissioned sculptors to carve statues showing Incitatus in heroic poses, and talked seriously and at length about making the horse's official heir to the throne, about how the empire would be better governed by an honest animal than by the corrupt aristocrats who surrounded him and constantly schemed for their own advantage. While some of this was clearly designed to humiliate the Senate by showing them they were so worthless they could be replaced by livestock, there was also something genuine in how he treated the horse that went beyond political theater. He'd spend hours in the stable brushing Incitatus and talking to the animal like it was his closest confidant and the only creature he could truly trust, and when government officials needed urgent meetings with the emperor to discuss matters of war or taxation or administration, they'd often find him there whispering to the horse while the actual business of empire waited outside. The relationship went beyond even genuine affection into something stranger as Caligula started describing Incitatus in romantic terms, talking about marriage to the animal, claiming the horse was the only creature pure and noble enough to truly understand divinity and be worthy of standing beside a god. He'd drape himself across the animal's back during Senate meetings, kiss its muzzle in front of assembled dignitaries who had to maintain straight faces, interrupt important state business to go check on the horse's comfort and happiness. He genuinely seemed to prefer Incitatus's company to any human being in his life, and senators would sit through meetings watching their emperor nuzzle a horse and talk to it lovingly while discussing whether to invade Britain or how to handle grain shortages. And they had to act like this was appropriate behavior for a head of state because questioning why the ruler of Rome was treating a horse like a romantic partner meant questioning his divine judgment, and that meant execution. The combination of everything, the public incest with Drusilla that he'd transformed into state religion, the romantic obsession with a horse that he'd elevated to political office, the constant orgies and public rapes that had become regular features of palace life. All of it created this suffocating atmosphere of surreal terror where nobody knew what boundary would be violated next because he'd already crossed every single one that civilized society recognized. Normal social rules didn't exist in the palace anymore as senators would walk through halls where the emperor's horse had its own suite of rooms more elaborate than their own homes, past chambers where yesterday's dinner guests had been tortured overnight and were still chained to walls, attend banquets where the host might be wearing a dress or might be naked or might be dressed as Venus or Jupiter and they had to treat all of it as normal. The executions that had always been part of Roman justice transformed under Caligula from necessary state functions into theatrical performances designed specifically for his amusement and to reinforce the message that human life meant nothing compared to his divine whims. He'd host games in the arena where criminals fought to the death, which was standard Roman entertainment, but between the scheduled matches he'd suddenly point at someone in the crowd, maybe a senator who looked bored or a wealthy merchant who hadn't cheered loud enough during the previous fight, and guards would drag them down into the arena to be killed right then and there without any charges or trial or explanation. These weren't punishments for crimes these people had committed. There was no legal proceeding or accusation of wrongdoing. He just felt like watching that particular person die in that particular moment, and his whim was the only law that mattered in the empire. The crowd would watch these respectable citizens, people who'd been sitting next to them moments before, get torn apart by animals or hacked down by gladiators still covered in blood from the previous fight, and they'd have to applaud and cheer with appropriate enthusiasm because showing any reluctance to enjoy the show meant you'd be the next entertainment dragged into the sand. The palace itself became his primary stage for these performances, as he'd converted several rooms into what he called temples, decorated with religious imagery and proper altars, but they were really just torture chambers where he performed elaborate executions that he treated like sacred rituals, with himself playing the role of an avenging god dispensing divine judgment on mortals who'd displeased him. Victims would be brought straight from dinner parties where they'd been eating and drinking and socializing, still dressed in their fine clothes and holding wine cups, suddenly finding themselves chained in these rooms while Caligula performed prolonged executions that could last hours. Sometimes he'd invite other guests to watch these sessions, forcing senators to witness in explicit detail what happened when you displeased divinity, and the screaming would echo through marble halls while other guests in nearby rooms tried to continue their conversations and pretend they couldn't hear what was happening just a few doors away. The cruelty had a calculated quality to it, as everything seemed designed for maximum psychological impact rather than being just random violence born from uncontrolled rage. He'd pardon someone at the very last second before their scheduled execution, let them walk free and return to normal life for days or weeks while they tried to understand why they'd been spared, then suddenly have them dragged back for the same crime and killed before they could even comprehend what had changed in his thinking. He'd force fathers to watch their sons tortured and executed in front of them, then require those fathers to attend a feast that same evening where they had to laugh and joke and act happy while their child's body was still cooling in some palace chamber. He'd announce someone's execution publicly with great ceremony, then show up at their house for dinner the next day acting like nothing had happened, and the condemned person would have to host him and smile and pretend everything was fine while trying to figure out if the execution was still happening or if they'd been pardoned or if this was just another game he was playing with their terror. The randomness was deliberate and served a specific purpose in maintaining his control, because if people could predict what would anger him, then they could avoid those behaviors and feel some measure of safety. But by making his violence completely arbitrary, he kept everyone in a constant state of paralyzing fear, because literally anything could trigger him without warning. Looking at him the wrong way could mean death, but so could not looking at him enough. Laughing too much at his jokes could be suspicious, but not laughing enough was definitely fatal. Applauding too early or too late at performances, wearing the wrong color to a party, any tiny detail could suddenly become a capital offense without explanation. By 41 AD, after less than 4 years on the throne, the fear Caligula had so carefully cultivated throughout the palace and senate had finally created enough desperation for someone to act against him despite the enormous risk. The conspiracy formed among his own Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers whose entire job was protecting the emperor's life, because they'd seen too much of what happened behind palace walls and understood that nobody was actually safe from him. Not even the armed men who stood closest to him every day. The plot involved multiple officers and had quiet support from senators who were extremely careful to keep their involvement hidden, because if the assassination attempt failed, everyone connected to it would die in ways that would make all previous executions look merciful by comparison. They caught him in a palace hallway as he was moving between the theater and his private chambers after watching some performances, moving through a corridor that was temporarily empty of other witnesses. Cassius Chaerea, one of the Praetorian officers Caligula had repeatedly mocked for having an effeminate voice, struck first with his sword, stabbing the emperor from behind before Caligula even understood what was happening. He didn't comprehend the attack initially because he'd become so completely accustomed to people kneeling before him and treating him like an actual god that violence from his own guards seemed impossible in his mind, seemed to violate the fundamental order of reality as he understood it. He tried to call for help, tried to run toward where other guards might be stationed, but more conspirators closed in from the other direction and they stabbed him repeatedly with their swords, more than 30 wounds by the time they were finished with him. They killed him on the same marble floors where he'd performed his twisted ceremonies and rituals, in hallways that still smelled like wine and blood from the previous night's entertainment that had run late into the morning. His body was left lying there initially, just sprawled in the corridor like the bodies of his victims that palace servants had found so many times before, and the conspirators moved quickly to secure the rest of the palace and locate his wife and infant daughter, who they murdered as well to eliminate any possible heirs who might grow up seeking revenge for their father. The Senate met in emergency session and briefly debated trying to restore the Republic, actually ending the imperial system entirely since it had allowed someone like Caligula to seize absolute power and use it the way he had. But the Praetorian Guard had already made their decision about who would be the next emperor. They chose Claudius, Caligula's uncle who'd been hiding behind a curtain in the palace during the assassination, because the soldiers understood that emperor-making came with substantial bonuses and privileges and they weren't about to give up that lucrative arrangement just because one emperor had turned out to be a monster. The 4 years of Caligula's reign had fundamentally changed what Romans understood was possible for depravity and leadership, had proven that absolute power really did mean you could do literally anything without consequence, that incest and bestiality and torture and murder could all become official state policy if nobody had the means to stop you. His body was hastily cremated and buried without any of the ceremony normally accorded to emperors, and Rome tried desperately to forget him by tearing down his statues, scraping his name off monuments and public buildings, attempting to erase him from history. But the memory of what he'd done during those 4 years lingered in Roman consciousness because he'd shown the empire exactly what could happen when a young man with unlimited power and no restraint whatsoever discovered that nobody in the world could tell him no, and that lesson about the dangers of absolute authority would haunt Roman politics for generations to come.